Welcome to the session about Azure Network Security Monitoring with Azure Sentinel. My name is Anthony Roman, and I work within Microsoft Engineering's Cloud Security Division, and my team focuses on helping customers deploy Azure Network Security tools. Our agenda today is going to cover quick reviews of both Azure Network Security and Azure Sentinel. After we review those two main topics, we're going to go into how to get data from the Azure Network Security tools into Azure Sentinel. And finally, once we have the data there, we're going to talk about how to analyze that data, alert on potential threats, and respond to those threats. First, with the network security review. When I say Azure Network Security, what I'm talking about is a set of tools within Azure that exist within both the network security and the application security areas. And so those main tools are Azure Firewall, Azure WAF, and Azure DDoS Protection, including a couple of other supporting tools, which we'll get into a little bit, but they won't be as much of a main focus as those others. First, Azure Firewall is a cloud-native firewall as a service. Think of it as a PaaS service that is able to either replace or augment what you're already doing with a network virtualized appliance. It will most often sit within a hub virtual network and detect direct traffic that is sent to it from its spoke VNets or from on-premise networks via an express route or a VPN connection. Firewall can both deny, allow traffic, and also detect threats that exist on your networks. So Firewall is one of the main pieces of the Azure Network Security stack that is going to be connected to Sentinel later on. Azure WAF exists as another PaaS service within Azure, but WAF is attached to multiple different services within Azure, such as Azure Front Door, Application Gateway, and CDN. WAF protects your applications from common web application attacks, such as SQL injection, cross-site scripting, and a host of other attacks and threats that can be configured as both managed rule sets and custom rules. And we'll get into custom rules quite a bit later on when it comes to responding to some of the threats that we're detecting. DDoS Protection Standard is a service that is above and beyond what we provide as the DDoS Protection Basic service that comes with Azure. DDoS Protection Basic will cover Azure itself from volumetric DDoS attacks. However, DDoS Protection Standard is recommended to be enabled when you have workloads that are running within Azure that you want custom protection for. DDoS Protection Standard will learn the amount of traffic that is expected to your applications or other publicly facing endpoints within Azure. And when traffic becomes too much, DDoS protection will jump in and mitigate potential DDoS attacks by inspecting and potentially dropping traffic if it turns out to be malicious. With all of these services, we'll integrate them with Sentinel. First, let's talk about what Sentinel is. I think most people should be familiar with Sentinel. It's gotten a lot of attention since it's one of our newest security tools within Azure. But for the sake of a quick review, Sentinel is a cloud-native SIEM and SOAR solution, which means it both collects and analyzes your log data, but it also gives you built-in mechanisms to respond to threats that are detected using that log data. And so we're going to go into how to use the various capabilities that Sentinel has, both in detection and response, and apply those to the data that network security tools bring. In order to get data into Sentinel, there's various ways to do that. There are connectors that exist for Sentinel for various services, both within Azure and in third-party tools. So the way that you will go about connecting data into Sentinel is using data connectors. With Azure native services, the data connectors exist, but you don't actually need to use them directly, and we'll see exactly what that means here. Before we get into the actual connection process of network security tool data into Sentinel, it makes sense to talk about the difference between a couple of different Azure log types. Now, we have Azure activity logs and we have Azure diagnostic logs. The two things are similar, but they're different in some very important respects. So let's take a second and talk about how they're different. Azure Activity Logs log activity that is on the platform level. So think of Azure Activity Logs as the way that you find out about what happened to the Azure portal. So if an admin logs in, creates a new resource, that's going to be logged within the Azure Activity Logs. However, anything that happens within those resources, so bringing the examples that we're using today, which is let's say Azure Firewall or WAF, any of the activity that is generated from within those services, so traffic passing through Azure Firewall, rule matches on Azure WAF, those things are all logged within diagnostic logs. You can put diagnostic logs as resource level logs, activity logs as platform level logs. So it makes sense to understand that distinction, because you have to enable both, or at least you should enable both, to get a full picture of what's happening within Azure. The Azure Sentinel data connectors for Azure WAF, Firewall, and DDoS protection are either brand new or recently updated. So I suggest that you check them out within Azure Sentinel. Pictured here is the Azure WAF connector, which covers, again, we talked about WAF being a service that attaches to front door, application gateway, and CDN. Within the Azure WAF connector, you have the ability to visualize whether you're getting data from any of or all of these covered services, and you also have links to how to actually enable the logging to go into Sentinel. So within the Sentinel connector page, the important things to realize are that it will tell you whether you have data connected. So that's essential for any security operations team. You need to know where data is coming from. And if you don't have that data, you have an easy way to go through the process of enabling that data. Now, once you click on any of the links to enable the diagnostic logs for the particular service that you're trying to enable, whether it's Firewall, WAF, or DDoS, you're just going to be linked to the diagnostic settings page within Azure. And that's the central place, or Azure Monitor would be the central place to enable those diagnostic logs. Whether it's for these tools or anything else within Azure, this is how you do it. Once you're in the diagnostic settings page, you have the ability to enable one or all of the different diagnostic settings categories, along with metrics, and you have the option to choose the destination where those logs will be stored. You can either choose storage, Event Hub, or Log Analytics. And if you're using Sentinel, Log Analytics is the preferred destination. And we recommend that you enable all categories plus metrics, because there can be potential security value in any and all of the types of categories that we enable. One quick tip to mention as we're talking about the categories to enable, and this is something that I use all the time when I can't remember what to search for within Log Analytics. If you look at the bullet point list of the different diagnostic settings that you can enable, each one of those strings is exactly the category that it corresponds to within the Log Analytics table. So in this example, our DDoS mitigation flow logs are the category that we would search for within Log Analytics. And if you forget what that's called, whether it's DDoS mitigation flow logs, or you don't know the exact wording of that category, you can just copy and paste from the diagnostic settings page, paste it into your Log Analytics query, and you'll find your logs much more easily. I use that cheat all the time. Now, one thing that we didn't mention within the main three categories of Azure Network Security tools, DDoS, Firewall, WAF, is NSGs. So NSGs are complementary to basically all of these services and all of Azure Network Security. The way that you get NSG data, which is the NSG flow logs, is that you need to enable them through Azure Network Watcher. And the best way to get that data within Sentinel is to use Network Watcher traffic analytics. And so within Network Watcher, you can enable both the NSG flow logs, and those have to go into a storage account currently. Traffic Analytics allows you to read from storage accounts and then write it back into Log Analytics. Therefore, Sentinel has a chance to actually analyze that data. So as you're thinking about your security data strategy, think about NSG flow logs, where to enable them, how to get that data into Sentinel, and use Traffic Analytics to do so. Once you have the data that you're going to collect within your Azure Sentinel Log Analytics workspace, Now it's time to figure out how to visualize that data and then how to analyze it and detect potential threats. So the first tool that we have within Sentinel in order to visualize the data is called workbooks. So workbooks are a feature of Azure Monitor, which have been adopted by Sentinel in order to visualize data. Think of workbooks as a newer and better version of dashboards. Workbooks are great because they're customizable, they are interactive, and you can do a ton with them. Once you create a workbook, either from scratch or you download a workbook from one of our GitHub repositories, you can customize that workbook to your liking. And some of the nice things that you can do with workbooks are that if you see interesting data on your screen, it doesn't have to stop there. You can use that data that you see in one workbook panel and pass it to the next panel within another query. And so we'll see how to do that in the demo later on. But the great thing about workbooks is that, one, customizable, two, you can actually interact with them. So aside from reusing the same data within that workbook, you can jump into log analytics at any point. If you see something interesting, you can just jump right into the logs and start investigating further. And most security analysts aren't content with looking at the visualization as the end goal. You want to get directly into the data eventually, but the workbook serves as a nice starting off point because you can easily figure out what might be important and then dive in from there. Another way to use the data that is in Sentinel is to create analytic rules. Analytic rules are essentially the alert rules that Azure Sentinel uses to detect and create incidents from threats that we see. Essentially, all an analytic rule is a query within log analytics that runs on a schedule. There's lots of other settings within each analytic rule that I won't get into right now, but the main point is that you can use an analytic rule along with a query that you've constructed that looks for threats within Azure Firewall data, WAF data, DDoS protection data, whatever it is, and you can create incidents based on what you've detected by that query. Once you've used analytic rules to detect potential threats within Azure Sentinel data, you can then use playbooks in order to respond to those threats. Playbooks can either be run automatically attached to one of the analytic rules, or if you're sure that you want to perform a particular remediation action after this detection has happened, or you can run them manually at any time just by clicking them. Playbooks are essentially just logic apps, rebranded for use within Sentinel. If you're familiar with Azure Logic Apps or Power Automate, which used to be called Flow, you'll be familiar with how Logic Apps operate. It's essentially picture any sort of scripting or coding language visualized within an easy-to-use GUI. You're able to use all kinds of familiar coding constructs like for each loops, conditionals, etc., in order to accomplish the task that you're trying to accomplish. And in our case, we're trying to remediate something that we've found using Azure Sentinel detections. So the thing that sets Azure Sentinel playbooks apart from a standard logic app is really just the trigger that they use. The beginning of any playbook or any logic app is a trigger, whether that's a recurrence event or whether it's a response to a particular action. In this case, we're running our playbooks or our logic apps in response to an Azure Sentinel detection. What that enables us to do is take some of the data that we found from Azure Sentinel and use it within our response. We'll go more in depth into this specific playbook in our demo, but the point to take away is that you can do almost anything that you can think of as an Azure Sentinel playbook. If you can do it with APIs or with any of the built-in connectors that logic apps have, then you can use those as an automated response action with Azure Sentinel. Now that we've covered most of the building blocks of how we're going to put together our detection and response scenario within Azure Sentinel, I'll take you through a quick demo of how this all looks together, from enabling your diagnostic logs, visualizing everything within workbooks, and then, again, detecting and responding to a potential threat.
This demo is going to focus on a detection and response scenario using Azure WAF and Sentinel, of course. So in this case, WAF I have attached to an application gateway. And the first thing I'll show is the diagnostic settings of that app gateway, where we have all of the log types going into log analytics workspace that happens to have Sentinel attached to it. Jumping over to Sentinel, the first place I'm going to look is this workbook. This is the Azure WAF workbook, which will cover any WAF type, whether it's app gateway, front door, or CDN, as long as those logs are going to the workspace that this is looking at, which this can do multiple workspaces. We can visualize the data here. What we'll see in this workbook is various different panels that show all kinds of different ways to slice and dice the data. To make this useful, the thing I want to concentrate on is the fact that workbooks are not meant to be just a static picture. They're meant to be interactive. They're meant for you to be able to use them as an actual security investigation tool. So we've made this workbook in such a way that you can click on each individual panel and filter the rest of the workbook based on what you've selected. So in this case, I've selected a particular URL. And based on that path, we can see the rest of the data that this workbook shows filtered on what we selected there. So, and you can multi-select. I can look at the different lines within these logs and the different attack types. And once we've found something that looks interesting and we want to see the details of it, we can always open up Log Analytics and it will pop this query out into a separate window where we can take this query and modify it to our liking to continue the investigation. So that's one way that we can proactively take a look at our data. Another way that we can use the data within Sentinel is by using analytic rules to detect potentially malicious behavior. The way that we're doing it here, for example, is we're going to use this analytic rule, which is going to be looking for multiple attacks against a web application coming from a unique source. So one common IP address launching multiple attacks at one of our web apps. And so I'll take a look at what this analytic rule looks like. Just like any Sentinel analytic rule, this is based on a log analytics KQL query. This happens to be a fairly simple query just for example, but you can do all kinds of things with this, and there's more of these available out on GitHub if you want to get a little bit more advanced with how you're detecting and what you're detecting. So some of the things that we're going to do with this analytic rule, it's going to run on a schedule, and when it does match something, when it detects what it's supposed to detect, it's going to create an incident as detailed here, and then it will also generate an automated response. And we have a playbook here called WAF block IP that is going to fire automatically when when an incident gets created from this analytic. What this is going to do, and we'll look at this in detail in a second, is it's going to block. The logic here is if we see a particular IP address attacking our web application over and over again, and WAF keeps blocking it, that's great, but we're just going to say enough is enough. We want to block that IP address outright. We're going to use WAF to do so. The way we're going to do that is via this this playbook response action. So before we look at that, I'll take you over to the incidents tab and see what got created from this rule. So when this rule runs, it can create an incident, and you can see some of the details here. We have an incident from multiple web application attacks from common IP. Here's some of the entities that were pulled out, including right here, which is the IP address that attack came from, or those multiple attacks came from. With our Logic App Playbook, which I'll show you here, this is the response action. Once we see those multiple web attacks, we're going to take the information that Sentinel passes to this playbook through this Azure Sentinel trigger, and we're going to use it to eventually, and I won't expand everything here, but eventually what we do with this information is we're using the Azure REST API, and we're going to do a put request against the Web Application Firewall API and update the policy to block a particular IP. the way that we do that, there's lots of steps involved and a little bit of logic that allows us to create a new custom rule or append to an existing one. You can take a look at all this. It's published on GitHub. And once we get to this point, this is what it looks like within the portal. You can see that after this playbook has run, I have a Sentinel block IP custom rule within my application gateway WAF policy. And what this rule does is it looks for, it's just a simple remote address, IP address match, and it looks for an address that is within this array. And now you can see that this array is pretty long. This is a rule that's been running for some time. And the nice thing is that it just adds new IP addresses to this block list once we see that we've got malicious activity. So you can see that this last IP address here should be the same as what we saw over here. So end to end, this is one scenario that you can build within Sentinel and Azure Network Security to do detection and response based on this data. You can do very similar things with Azure Firewall and DDoS protection as you can do with WAF, as you've seen here.
Now that we've seen everything working together, we can summarize everything that we've covered so far in this visualization that shows Azure Network Security tools and all of the supporting tools that goes along with them. Again, to summarize, those are Azure Firewall, DDoS protection, WAF, and then the supporting tools would be things like NSGs and their flow logs. Bastion could be included, Network Watcher, of course. All of these tools generate data into diagnostic logs. Those diagnostic logs can then be added to log analytics for analysis in Sentinel. We've covered workbooks, we've covered analytics, and we've covered playbooks for response. One thing that we didn't really touch on in this presentation because it's a bit outside the scope, but I think is relevant to mention is the integration with Azure Security Center. These tools have various integrations with Security Center in both detecting threats and also remediating configuration abnormalities through SecureScore. So Azure Sentinel provides the most customizable option for integration for network security tools, but Security Center should also be looked at because it definitely provides some great features that enrich what we're doing with Sentinel and Azure Network Security combined. We've covered various types of integrations of network security and Sentinel. If you don't see what you want within the Azure portal, which most of this is available directly in the portal, you can always check our GitHub repos. We have a GitHub repo for both network security and one specifically for Azure Sentinel, which includes the network security tools as part of it. So if you're interested in downloading a copy of any of these things, feel free to take a look at our GitHub repos. And also, we encourage you to contribute. If you've written something that is particularly effective in your environment, chances are it's also effective for other customers, and the community would benefit from your contribution. So please, if you like what you see there, please give back to the community. Everyone will be grateful. I appreciate you spending your time with me learning about Azure Network Security and Azure Sentinel, and I hope that you can take what you learned today to make your Azure networks more secure. Thanks again.